It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others around the Gulf here.
Before we got to Syria, we had Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do you want to take some responsibility for that? Do you want to take more refugees here in Qatar? Do you want to take more in the Gulf?
No one is immune to any sort of criticism.
In this latest debate, Douglas Murray takes the stage to address the global refugee crisis in an unexpected and thought-provoking setting: Qatar. Notably, despite its prominent role in the Middle East, Qatar has not signed the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which sets the legal framework for protecting refugees worldwide. This absence raises important questions about the responsibilities of nations in the current global crisis. The debate has garnered significant attention, particularly for a moment where Murray engages in a heated exchange with a Muslim activist, discussing the complexities of migration, identity, and state sovereignty.
I've been traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. We can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We've thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too. Let me give you a 5th question. How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on. How do we work out where that might be the case? And how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate?
Douglas Murray's insights into the migration debate are particularly relevant in today's geopolitical landscape, where increasing conflicts, economic disparities, and climate change are driving unprecedented migration levels. His emphasis on the competing virtues of mercy and justice reflects a critical recognition of the multifaceted challenges that both migrants and host countries face. Murray's call for nuanced discourse is essential in the current situation, characterized by rising anti-immigrant sentiment and political polarization. The distinction between asylum seekers fleeing life-threatening situations and those escaping dire economic conditions should be acknowledged, as it holds significant implications for public policy and societal response. The lack of clarity in these definitions can easily lead to public confusion and disillusionment, ultimately undermining compassion for those most in need.
Sixth question: how do we overcome fatalism? Fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this, because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far. Thank you.
As social media plays a profound role in shaping public opinion and accelerating responses to humanitarian crises, it often emphasizes sensationalism over substance. This can lead to knee-jerk reactions from policymakers that fail to consider the long-term ramifications. Murray's plea for a deeper and more meaningful dialogue about migration encourages us to engage with these complex realities rather than succumb to simplified narratives. In the face of growing uncertainty and division, fostering a comprehensive, informed, and compassionate dialogue on migration policy is critical for creating sustainable solutions that respect both human dignity and the needs of society. His insights compel us to look beyond emotional reactions and embrace a more rational, humane approach to one of the most pressing issues of our time.
Douglas Murray, thank you very much. A few provocative thoughts, no doubt, that you mentioned there. A few jumped at me, such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission.
No, I don't.
It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East,
Sure.
in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't think to address it in any
I'd
way.
also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like, but let
don't
me
we
just
have to be factful, though?
Well,
Don't we have to be
But also, don't
careful about
think,
facts,
if I
about
may say
history?
so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire?
We're
Do we
talking
say
about-
that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with
That's not
Islam?
the issue. You
brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay where they belong.
I'm saying that it seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This isn't say all of them, but it is more likely. I absolutely agree they do. I've seen it
look
firsthand.
at
What I'm
Turkey,
suggesting.
3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What
the
I'm
countries that have
suggesting
the
to you
most. In
is-
fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is
Absolutely.
a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea. I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in
But
Norway.
they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who, in their right
I'm not
mind, if
suggesting
they
they
had
don't
the
want to
option,
return. When did I
and
say
we will
that?
hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't.
They leave everything behind. But you seem to also be oblivious to another important fact that I just want to throw at you before we go to a video clip that I want to show you. It's what about the moral responsibility, though, of Western countries that have contributed to the destabilization of the region, the meddling, the military interventions, not to mention the arms sales that continue as we speak?
The debate between Douglas Murray and the moderator isn't just a debate, it's a collision of worldviews, a fierce clash over who bears the responsibility for one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time. Murray strides onto the stage with the confidence of someone who believes he's holding the trump card. The idea that refugees should remain close to their homelands, within the cultural and geographical spheres where they belong. He frames this as a practical, almost obvious solution, devoid of the moral complexities that others might see. But then, the moderator fires back with a hard-hitting reality check that the developed world didn't just grow in isolation. It spread its influence across continents, often through force, and left a trail of chaos in its wake. Colonialism isn't just a dusty chapter in history books. It's a living, breathing force that still shapes the destinies of nations. And when Murray tries to sidestep this by pointing to the Ottoman Empire, it's clear he's deflecting, not engaging.
You want me to answer that? Okay, I'll answer that one frankly. Nobody denies, for instance, the disaster of Iraq. But who are the people who intervened most in Syria?
Isn't just Iraq.
Hang on. Let me answer it. Who intervened most in Syria? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain. It's Iran, Russia. It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others
You're
around the
deflecting.
Gulf
Before
here.
we got to
Let's
Syria,
face
we
it,
had
that
Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this
instances.
neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do
pouring
you want to
money
take
at
some
it, aren't you?
responsibility for that? Do
I
you want to
think-
take more
I think
refugees
blame
here
can-
in Qatar?
certainly
Do you
can
want to
go
take
around.
more in the Gulf?
No one
Right.
is immune to any sort of criticism.
well,
but we're talking
I'm
about
glad to hear
the
it.
Western countries, the British countries, the British
What did Britain do in Syria?
We're talking about these governments that you seem to suggest should be immune.
No,
or
when
should
did I
be
suggest that?
absolved of any.
Murray's attempt to minimize the West's role in this crisis by downplaying the impact of colonialism and deflecting blame to other powers is more than just a rhetorical misstep. It's a dangerous rewriting of history. The West's hands aren't clean, and the scars of its past actions are etched into the fabric of today's refugee crises. When Murray argues for keeping refugees in their regions of origin, it's a statement that rings hollow without acknowledging the role the West played in making those regions uninhabitable in the first place.
Let's take a quick look at this instance involving refugees.
Do you send anyone for us? We are the Syrians, about 300.
Sir, I give you the number of Malta authority because you are near Malta.
Hello?
Yes.
About 100 children and 100 women and maybe 100 men. Please hurry. Water is coming into it. The boat is going down. We are dying. 300 persons.
You have called Malta. You have called Malta.
Don't throw us. You can run away.
Call Malta. Call Malta.
I have no enough account on the mobile. It will cut. Please. You have
Yes.
my number now. You call me. You please.
A very chilling video, though I don't suggest that you respond on behalf of the Coast Guard, the Italian Coast Guard. But again, it's that same issue of shifting the problem to others. And just for a little bit of context, in fact, this boat, which capsized 5 hours after this call, killing quite a few people on board, we heard that there were about 100 women, 100 children on board, that was twice as close to an Italian island as it was to Malta. But again, this idea that, you know, we have to safeguard our values, where does mercy fit in that? Not just mercy, but the obligation, the legal obligations of states towards refugees.
I'd suggest that we all make sure we don't shift responsibility. There is a responsibility to everyone. That would include the state we're standing in now, wouldn't it? It would include all the states in this region. It would include the brother states. It would include the Ummah. It would include everybody. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it, because you mentioned the states of the region. It's a valid issue, but unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point, unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention, so the legal obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
This is a powerful snapshot of the fierce moral and political battle over how to handle the refugee crisis. A crisis that has pushed the boundaries of national interest, legal obligations, and humanity itself. Douglas Murray's call for shared global responsibility, including from Middle Eastern nations, hits a nerve. Europe, particularly frontline countries like Italy, is overwhelmed. The sheer number of refugees arriving daily, often on death-defying journeys, is pushing these nations to their limits. The strain is real, and Murray's argument that Europe cannot carry this burden alone is compelling. Yet the moderator's response cuts through with a chilling reality. Europe can do more with its vast resources and population. The 3 million asylum seekers who arrived between 2015 and 2016 represent a mere fraction of Europe's population, a burden that, with the right policies and support, should be manageable. The generosity of local populations, like those in Lampedusa, is admirable, but they are being asked to bear the brunt of a crisis that requires a unified global response.
This means that countries that are signatories to the refugee conventions get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be able to absolve themselves from blame. But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it because the resources are not being poured into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there.
I see these people when they arrive, I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't, you know, the local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa, I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous. They are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe, let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted.
No,
countries in Europe have taken in a lot of people, and they are trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
Just putting the numbers in context, let me just mention this very briefly. 3 million people sought asylum in Europe between 2015 and 2016. That's a fraction of the population of Europe, which is 508 million.
And Germany and Sweden took in 3% of the population in 1 year alone. So we're not talking about negligible numbers, and you shouldn't pretend that we are.
Not across the board, certainly. Douglas Murray, thanks very much.
Thank you.
What Murray sidesteps, however, is Europe's deep entanglement in the very conflicts that drive these refugees to its shores. The destabilization of the Middle East and North Africa, fueled by European military interventions and arms sales, places a moral weight on Europe that cannot be ignored. The refugee crisis is not just a logistical challenge. It is a test of Europe's commitment to the principles of humanity and justice.
Simply the fact that you could, I don't know, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. You think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician? You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple solution like that. As, if I may just add quickly to the previous two comments, the late, very distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful rule he came up with, known as Moynihan's Law, where he said that human rights, claims of human rights violations often happen in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, you hear about them in the countries that are most free.
A man from the audience asks Murray about the vast economic chasm between the developed and developing worlds, and its role in fueling the relentless tide of migration. The question lays bare a brutal truth. While the West prides itself on sending billions in aid, the developing world hemorrhages trillions back in debt repayments. This vicious cycle of wealth extraction leaves poorer nations trapped in poverty, pushing their citizens to seek a better life in the very countries that profit from their suffering.
And before long, you can end up with the presumption that the most free countries are the ones who are most abusive of human rights. And this happens with the case when we talk about our leaders and the ones... It's all very well. We can talk about the Trump administration. We can talk about the democracies and so on for all we like. We can all make criticisms, and we all should. But, okay,
briefly.
Mr. Putin, what are you going to do about him? What are you going to do about the mullahs in Iran? What are you going to do about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia? You see, what we end up with is this situation. We go, oh, Mr. Trump, Mr. Trump. We can all do that. Believe me, I can riff on Trump
again, you're being
all
quite
day.
selective, aren't you?
What are you going to do about the people you can't do anything about? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to give them a pass? Or are you just going to enjoy beating up on the democracy?
I hate to have to interrupt you. There's something called democracy, though, isn't there? Elections.
Murray's attempt to shift the focus to authoritarian regimes like Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, invoking Moynihan's Law, is another deflection. Sure, these regimes are guilty of heinous human rights abuses, but pointing fingers at them doesn't erase the West's own sins. Democracies, with all their talk of freedom and human rights, are not off the hook. The West cannot wash its hands of responsibility, while it continues to benefit from the exploitation of the very countries it claims to help.
So I'm going to talk briefly about, my mother's experience as an immigrant, and I want to touch on something that Mark Lamont Hill said, this power of education and telling people how refugees fit into the wider context of economic development. Here's why I'm very skeptical about that. Because when my mother arrived in the UK and her parents arrived in the UK, people still called them dirty packies. When she had graduated from Oxford University, she was still a brown person who was not seen as a citizen, right? So to what extent can we really sell this idea that being educated or fitting X, Y, and Z criteria is what you need to do as a refugee for people to humanize you? The inherent problem with these people is that they don't humanize you. You can't fulfill your oppressor's criteria so that they see you as human. So how do you humanize people?
Douglas Murray's argument, which centers on the fear of losing Western values and cultural purity, often misses the deeper issue. His fixation on visible symbols like the burqa and the supposed threat to freedom of speech taps into a broader anxiety about cultural change. While concerns about preserving core values are legitimate, focusing on such superficial aspects can overshadow the genuine struggles faced by immigrants.
The sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not. But I can't say I'm elated by it. And definitely there are times I think, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes like not that pleasant for everyone else.
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or going up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
You bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it doesn't want to give up. This one will. In Qatar, this one will. Everyone does. So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European thing.
Which of your values
are you most afraid to lose? That would be a very dishonest way to represent this debate.
Just answer this question directly if you can. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by the arrival of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one. Oh, you think that's not a problem?
I mean,
you think that's not a problem?
But
you think, sorry, no. Let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on that. It's very easy to snigger. It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
In today's global climate, where migration is a flashpoint for cultural and political tensions, it's crucial to confront the real sources of these issues. The debate shouldn't be reduced to fears of cultural dilution, but should address systemic inequalities and prejudices that drive migration and dehumanize those seeking refuge. This is a call for a more profound and empathetic dialogue that moves beyond the surface-level conflicts and grapples with the underlying injustices at play.
Douglas, do you think in the West, this fear of Islam or anything that looks so different to us?
No, I mean, the society I'm from is one of the most pluralistic and diverse societies on earth. You couldn't get a larger range of people of different backgrounds and ethnicities and languages than you have in Britain.
And
which is why I once again, if I may, push back against this thing you are pushing, which is that these are sort of uniquely bigoted, unwelcoming societies.
Not at all.
The evidence on this part of the stage would suggest that Britain is not,
for instance. I'm giving you the chance to tell us, from your perspective, what you find threatening or not about refugees coming to England.
Let me answer that by broadening it, if I may. My suggestion would be, if we're to arrive at any kind of common understanding on this, is that we agree that, for instance, where there are people who pretend that everyone who arrives is a terrorist is barking mad. Okay? We can agree with that, but don't laugh at people with serious concerns about serious security concerns either. Because
like what? This lays bare the intense struggle within Western societies, especially in Europe, as they confront the refugee crisis. Douglas Murray taps into a visceral fear, one that is not without reason. We can't ignore the chilling reality that among the millions seeking refuge, there have been those who turn to violence, shattering the illusion of safety in cities across Europe. It's easy to dismiss these fears as xenophobic hysteria, but that would be dangerously naive. When bombs go off in bustling towns and innocents are slaughtered, the fear is real and it's palpable.
You know, we had this in 2015 when certain officials in Europe said the likelihood that anyone coming on the boats among the 1.5 million people who arrived in Germany are going to be violent in any way is total, xenophobic fantasy. And everyone laughed until people started letting off bombs, until, like in Ansbach in Germany, they just had a suicide bombing outside a wine bar. And it just stopped being quite so funny. So all I'm saying to you is, you can agree with me that people who say that most people arriving are going to be violent are ridiculous. Yes, but also don't claim it's ridiculous for people to have serious and sincere concerns about what is happening. Because if you do, there's no way anyone's going to arrive.
And that is the reality. Absolutely, Mark. How do you deal with this? It is a reality.
The real danger isn't just in the possibility of violence from a tiny fraction of refugees, but in how easily fear can be weaponized to justify cruelty, exclusion, and the erosion of our most fundamental principles. We risk becoming a society that values security over compassion, walls over welcome. The refugee crisis demands more than just a security response. It demands a moral reckoning. Will we allow fear to dictate our actions, driving us to dehumanize those in need? Or will we rise above, confronting our fears with courage and upholding the values that define us? The choices we make will echo through history, defining who we are as a people in this moment of crisis.
That every society on earth has difficulty integrating people, okay, from a very different background.
Yes.
It's always difficult. Again, I don't think we should fall into this idea that Europeans are uniquely bad at it. We've had to do a lot of absorbing very fast, and we've done most of it very damn well. And bits of it haven't gone well, and we've got to address that. But again, we can agree that there is gun violence in America from crazy people who think they need to be armed to walk to the supermarket. And that doesn't mean, well, okay, but that doesn't mean that people in France don't have their own specific
Absolutely.
security concerns as well. And what I'm urging you to do is, let's not look at this just from an American point of view. In Europe, it is a serious security concern we have now, and we are trying to deal with it, and that shouldn't be laughed at.
Even though no one should laugh at this. But let me just say, the research shows, though, that there is no clear link between immigrants and refugees and an increased rate of crime. The research said that it's quite the opposite in the United States and in Europe.
The collision between the humanitarian imperative to welcome refugees and the chilling fear that this wave of newcomers might unravel the very fabric of European society. Douglas Murray voices a stark, unflinching concern, a deep-seated fear that Europe, in its noble attempt to offer sanctuary, is inviting chaos and violence into its own home. The spectre of terrorism looms large in his argument, and the memories of bombings and bloodshed are still fresh, casting a long shadow over the continent. He warns that these aren't just baseless fears. They're grounded in painful realities that have left scars on European soil. Yet the tension between these perspectives is palpable. Europe stands at a crossroads, torn between the instinct to protect its own and the moral obligation to offer sanctuary to those in desperate need. The risk is clear. In our attempt to shield ourselves from potential threats, we may lose sight of the values that define us: freedom, tolerance, and the sanctity of human life. As we wrap up this intense debate, the question now turns to you, our viewers. You've heard both sides, felt the tension, and seen the clash of ideas. Now, it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think? Do we prioritize security, or do we stand firm in our commitment to compassion? How do we strike that delicate balance between protecting our societies and upholding our shared humanity? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this crucial conversation going. Your voice matters, and together we can shape the future. If this debate sparked something in you, don't hold back. Join the discussion now.